Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well. So in this session, which is the last session, we're going to be discussing creating a more inclusive and impactful peace and disarmament debate. So today we have three speakers. We have Anthea Ennequin from Guido Carli University, who's a master's student in international relations, and she'll be looking at eco-centric diplomacy as a path to deterrence. And then we have Franco Castro Escobar, who's a PhD candidate and research fellow at Keele University's David Bruce Center for the Study of the Americas and Hiroshima Peace Institute. And he'll be discussing youth organizing at the dawn of a post-Hibakusha anti-nuclear movement. And then lastly, we have Joel and Christoph, who's a PhD researcher at the European University Institute, and you'll be looking at from hidden unilateralism to multipolar acceleration, historical analysis of nuclear realist power politics and its implications for disarmament. So I guess first we'll start off with Anthea. So over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, thank you for organizing invite. It's an honor to be here today to discuss an issue that, despite its grave implication, remains largely overlooked. So the environmental consequences of nuclear weapons and how environmental diplomacy can serve as a tool for disarmament. When we think about nuclear weapons, the dominant narrative revolves around deterrence, military power, and strategic stability. We hear about multiple theories, arms race, and geopolitical posturing, but rarely do we talk about the long-term environmental devastation these weapons cause. At the same time, environmental diplomacy has mainly focused on climate change, mitigation, and sustainability goals, often treating security as a separate domain. But what if these fields were more interconnected than we think? So before we proceed, I want to clarify two key concepts that will shape the discussion today: eco-centric diplomacy and environmental diplomacy. These two approaches are complementary, but they emphasize different aspects of integrating ecological concerns into international relations. Eco-centric diplomacy is more of a normative shift, a way of rethinking foreign policy by placing environmental sustainability at the center of decision-making, rather than treating it as a secondary to political or economic interests. And environmental diplomacy is more institutional and policy-driven. It focuses on the negotiation and the implementation of international agreements to address environmental challenges like climate change, biodiversity loss, and resources management. So for this presentation, I will use both concepts because environmental diplomacy provides the institutional mechanism and legal frameworks for cooperation, whereas eco-centric diplomacy offers a broader paradigm shift. So my central argument is that by framing arms control and nuclear disarmament as a matter of ecological survival, we can create new incentives for disarmament that transcend geopolitical rivalries. The environment is a shared resource that nations must protect together, and this common ground can be leveraged to reduce nuclear risks. So about environmental security and conflict, climate change is, we all know, no longer a distant hypothetical concerns. It has become a direct driver of conflict and instability worldwide. Environmental security is emerging as one of the defining challenges of our time, intersecting with the geopolitics, resource competition, and forced migration. I mean, military experts, intelligence agencies, scholars have long recognized that climate change acts as a threat multiplier, exacerbating existing tensions, and conflicts by intensifying resource scarcity, leading to competition over water, food, arable land, economic instability, weakening state structures, and increasing vulnerabilities, and political tensions, fueling grievances that escalate into violence. We have many examples of climate-driven conflicts. The Syrian civil war, so many, like even the Arctic tensions, none of we think about it. And this case demonstrates that climate change is not just an environmental issue, it is a security challenge. Yet despite these clear trends, traditional security approaches remain locked in, according to me, outdated paradigms, failing to account for the environmental drivers of instability. So now why traditional security approaches are failing, still according to me. So despite mounting evidence that environmental degradation fuels instability, security, policies continue to prioritize military deterrence over ecological resilience. Since the 1972 Stockholm Conference, environmental diplomacy has been recognized as an essential pillar of international cooperation, yet its role in security remains underutilized. And why is this a problem? Because there are some limitation to military deterrence in the 21st century. It is not that effective against non-state actors. So military deterrence is designed for state-to-state conflict, but many of today's most pressing security threats comes from non-state actors. It is also a bit inadequate for hybrid threats. So modern conflicts are rarely now purely military. They often involve a combination of conventional warfare, cyber attacks, economic coercion, and climate-induced instability. So yeah, and environmental and climate changes are not military problems. Like deterrence theory is built on the assumption that adversaries will act rationally in response to military threats, but ecological crises do not respond to military force. And despite this limitation, governments continue to invest billions in nuclear weapons and traditional military infrastructure. So this brings us to another.
Go to the next slide.
Yes, thank you very much. Critical oversight is the environmental devastation caused by nuclear weapons, which remains largely absent from mainstream arms control to date. The dangers of nuclear weapons go far beyond the immediate explosive impact. Most discussion on nuclear policy focus on deterrence theory or the risk of proliferation, but few people talk about the long-term environmental devastation. So we have one of the first thing is the nuclear winter and the agricultural collapse. So full-scale nuclear war would inject massive amount of soot into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and causing global cooling. And that will lead to widespread famine and food shortage. A study published by Nature Food in 2022 estimated that over 2 billion people could starve due to nuclear-induced climate disruptions. We also have the radioactive fallout and ecosystem contamination. So nuclear test and detonation contaminate air, soil, and water for decades, leading to cancer also and genetic mutation and biodiversity loss in general. And we have the issue related to ozone depletion and ocean acidification. So this is why I think we need to reframe nuclear disarmament as also an urgent environmental issues. And for that, I have some recommendation-ish. So if we are serious about preventing future nuclear threats and mitigating the catastrophic nuclear consequences of nuclear weapons, we must take decisive steps to integrate eco-centric and environmental diplomacy into disarmament efforts. First of all, we can link arms control treaties with environmental agreements. So for decades, arms control treaties and environmental agreements have existed in separate diplomatic sphere. This must change. Disarmament should be integrated into global environmental governance with legally binding commitment to assess and mitigate the ecological consequences of nuclear arsenal. For example, we can integrate nuclear disarmament into the Sustainable Development Goals, since sustainability is already a major global agenda. Linking nuclear disarmament to SDGs, particularly those focused on environmental preservation and climate action, can provide a structured framework for action. This could involve creating a milestones within the international forums, like the UN, that consider both disarmament and environmental protection as parallel interlinked goals. We can expand existing arms control treaties to include the environmental safeguards, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty should explicitly include environmental damage assessment as part of their verification and compliance mechanism. We can integrate disarmament goals also into climate agreement. Just as the Paris Agreement sets emission reduction targets, nuclear armed states should be required to report on the environmental risk associated with their nuclear arsenal. I think a climate security nexus should be established within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to examine how nuclear weapons testing, maintenance, and potential use exacerbate environmental degradation. We also might need to strengthen legal accountability for environmental damage caused by nuclear weapons. So nuclear armed states should be held legally responsible for the long-term ecological and humanitarian costs of their arsenal. For example, in 2022 in France, France finally admitted to underestimating the impact of its nuclear test in Polynesia, and it took decades of activism to force recognition. And I think future treaties should prevent this kind of environmental negligence. We should also mobilize public and civil society to support for this eco-centric disarmament. Government, as I just said, acts when public pressure makes an action politically costly. The environmental movement has already demonstrated its power. It has shaped the international agreement, driving corporate accountability and mobilized millions around the world. And now this momentum must be harnessed for nuclear disarmament. So how can this be achieved? Frame nuclear disarmament as an environmental justice issue. Public concerns over climate change has skyrocketed in recent years, and I think we must connect nuclear disarmament to this existing awareness. We can leverage grassroots movement to influence policy as well. For example, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, ICAN, successfully pressured government, and by mobilizing civil society, and eventually won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. And I think similar activism should push for a nuclear disarmament framework grounded in this eco-centric diplomacy. Of course, we can increase public awareness through media and education. And I think we should also use scientific and diplomatic tools to enforce environmental accountability in arms control agreements. So, as it was already mentioned in the last panel, nuclear disarmament treaties often lack strong compliance measures, verification mechanism typically focus on security risks, but overlook environmental consequences. To ensure real accountability, we must integrate scientific monitoring and ecological verification tools into arms control agreements. And how can this be achieved? We can use radiation monitoring as a disarmament compliance tool. Existing nuclear arms control mechanisms should incorporate environmental impact monitoring. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization already operates a global network of seismic, hydroacoustic, and infrasound sensors to detect nuclear tests. And I think this monitoring network could be expanded to track radioactive contamination, biodiversity loss, and atmospheric changes linked to nuclear activities. We can also conduct independent ecological surveys. International organizations such as the International Atomic Energy Agency and the United Nations Environment Programs should be given greater authority to investigate the environmental impacts of nuclear arsenals. So, yeah, that was it. Thank you.
Okay, well, hi everyone. My name is Franco Escobar, and I study the anti-nuclear global disarmament history. And with support from Keele University and Hiroshima Peace Institute, I spent 3 months in Japan conducting oral history interviews with young people, like the ones you see on the screen, to understand when did they first come across with the concept of nuclear weapons, why did they join an anti-nuclear organization, and basically how did they gain a sense of urgency about nuclear issues when everyone else seems to have forgotten about them. So the people I interviewed are as young as 11 years old and as old as about 31, 32 years old. The people you see on the screen are high school students gathering around Nagasaki, around that obelisk, which is marks the hypocenter in 1945. And through my research, I have found that these young people do not organize as a result of a sense of urgency, and instead they organize for other reasons, which I'm hoping to talk about today. I'm going to divide my talk in 3 sections. Firstly, I'd like to argue that we need to be critical of our discourses about peace. And one way of doing this is by rethinking, for example, what it means, how we talk about the Cold War. Usually we think of it as a period of a long peace, and I will argue today that we can think of it as a period of time in which we fought a limited nuclear war. Secondly, I'll argue that we should visualize the decline of the anti-nuclear movement, not to practice doomerism, but to try to identify opportunities where young people or anyone really can get involved in the struggle against the bomb. And lastly, I'm going to show you some quotes from my research to illustrate the motivations why young people join anti-nuclear organizations. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the Cold War as a long peace, we treat the atomic bomb as a discrete event, and we imagine that the use of nuclear weapons is a historical non-event, that it only exists in fiction or in speculation. And when we talk about the Cold War, we were using a metaphor to indicate the temperature of the conflict between the USA and the Soviet Union, where nuclear weapons symbolize the hot war that we supposedly avoided, right? But paradoxically, nuclear weapons are also a symbol of peace through strength, so it's a symbol of both, because despite the arms race, the political tensions, the risks of mutually assured destruction, nonetheless, nuclear war was successfully deterred. And this is all taken as evidence of the nuclear revolution, the idea that nuclear weapons raised the cost of war so high that it made victory impossible for any adversaries, making war not longer the extension of of politics, but making war the end of politics. Next slide, please. So, this has now been argued as a myth. Nuclear weapons did not revolutionize international relations because nuclear armed states continue to seek relative advantages. They prepare and invest for conventional warfare. They seek to build new alliances and gain territory. Relationships have not been pacified in countries that possess nuclear weapons or in those regions. Instead, nuclear weapons seem to create this competitive process where countries try to produce and maintain stalemate, which is that condition where war cannot be won. And that's to say very little about how nuclear weapons are used, not just to deter, but to coerce as a diplomatic tool. Next slide, please. I was going to show you a video. Just 5 seconds maybe. And what I wanted, the reason why I wanted to show you this is because when we think of, you can play it without the audio. When we think about the long peace as a time in which no nuclear weapons were used, we're ignoring more than 2,000 nuclear detonations that did happen between 1946 and 1991, averaging about 40-ish per year. Thank you. And therefore, this is really, when we say that the long peace, there were no nuclear weapons used, we're really saying they were not used against us. They were not used against our bodies. They were used in territories and people that were deemed expendable or marginalized or that had colonial ties with nuclear weapon states. Next slide, please. If we think of the long peace as a narrative that prevents us from seeing the warlike effects of nuclear testing or the Cold War, this would prevent us from seeing how that time was not so peaceful. So in Rongelap, in the Marshall Islands, for example, if you were 152 kilometers away from the Bikini test, you would have received an equal amount of gamma ray radiation than someone just 2.4 kilometers away from Hiroshima. And I'm showing you images of 2 young people in the Marshall Islands, not to impress you, but to make the case that young people are most vulnerable from the effects of nuclear weapons. Their bodies are more frail, and that makes them less likely to be able to escape from collapsed structures. Their skin is thinner, which means the heat burns deeper and more intense. And because their bodies are still growing, that means they still have tissue that reproduces cells more rapidly, making them more vulnerable to radiation-induced illnesses. Next slide, please. And so it is the oral history and their bodies and their testimonies. And in fact, some of the successors of the people who survived nuclear testing are the ones who are keeping the struggle against nuclear weapons today. You may think that it's not fair to think of the Cold War as an actual war. However, war is typically defined as a conflict that results in about 1,000 deaths per year. And IPPNW have estimated that Cold War nuclear testing would have resulted in about 500,000 fatal cancers by the year 2000. So that's already a lot more than 1,000 per year. Although we can also be critical of these estimates, and there has been some criticism of it. And this argument that the Cold War was a limited nuclear war, not a long peace, is not mine. It's by American historian Robert Jacobs, where he says that these nuclear tests were limited in the sense that the heat, the blast, and the gamma rays were indeed contained to the testing sites that were selected as targets, to permit that economic, social, and political trends would continue in their national territories without confronting their enemies. In that way, they were self-inflicting harm in territories and people that, like I said, were expendable. And not just people, that's why I show you tuna that was discarded and destroyed after 94 Castle Bravo in Japan, after the tuna market went into a complete halt due to fears of radioactive tuna. Next slide, please. That was my first argument. The second one is that I believe it's important we visualize the decline of the anti-nuclear movement. And this graph, what it's showing you is how much we publish books about the terms nuclear weapons and atomic bomb. And we can see that the 3 peaks of activity in our intellectual engagement with these concepts actually coincided with the 3 peaks of anti-nuclear activism. So one of the successes of anti-nuclear activism was to keep the issue in the agenda and to help us articulate anxieties, solutions, proposals, ideas. And even though we say that in the so-called third nuclear age, there's a renewed interest in nuclear weapons, we are yet to see an increase in our engagement with these concepts. In fact, many scholars argue that we have left behind a golden age of nuclear disarmament in the 80s and the 60s, and that today only a very small minority of people participate in activism, in arms control lobbying, or believe in the idea of nuclear abolition. Some people believe that this movement is not just dormant or stalled, but it's actually ebbing at a historic time. Next slide, please. So in my research, as I said, I study why young people join these movements, and I rely on a theory known as political socialization, which is a process whereby we learn how the world is organized, how it should be organized, who we are, and what society expects from us. Next slide, please. Which is why I operationalize that definition by asking questions such as, when did you first encounter the concept of nuclear weapons? Meaning your understanding of how the world is organized about these weapons. And I don't have time to go through all of them, but I'm showing you these 2. And why did you join your first anti-nuclear activity? Next slide, please. So in Japan, it is said that peace education makes it so that every child learns at school that Japan became a peaceful and democratic country after the atomic bomb. Once again, I started this talk saying we should be critical of these discourses about peace. And children go to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. They have family members who are Hibakusha ancestors, schools, libraries that wear the scars of war, buildings are preserved. There's many ways in which you can learn about this history, and you would expect that anti-nuclear activism would be a lot more active. Next slide, please. However, the interviews I conducted in Japan show that young people exposed to this history as early as 4 or 5 years old, when they learn about this, they say, I don't feel any relationship with that history. I didn't have the feeling that it could actually happen to me. Although such history was horrible and it should not be repeated, I could not find any immediate threats today. Next slide, please. Another participant says, we didn't learn about the situation today. How many nuclear weapons around the world now? Who have these nuclear weapons? I don't think I learned about these things. So in a way, the atomic bomb was taught as a concept about the past, something that happened 79 years ago. And nuclear weapons, which was not taught to them, is about today's society, politics, and our life. Next slide, please. Other participants who even have grandparents or great-grandparents who are survivors would say to me things like, okay, the bomb was dropped here in 1945, but it's not anymore, so why do I have to care about this history? Unlike climate change, where we feel the temperature difference every single year, that's very urgent. After this person went to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, they found themselves under a nice blue sky with convenience stores and shops nearby, so they couldn't sense, they saw this history as irrelevant. Sorry, quick clarification, this person is not 3rd or 4th generation Hibakusha, the past person was. Next slide, please. And the last example I wanted to show you is that young people in Japan today do not necessarily perceive the anti-nuclear cause as something that's for young people. This person says that when they saw the news about people working for nuclear abolition, it was technically old people, like their grandmother or grandfather's generation, including the Hibakusha. And from their recognition, it was a movement for either people who had that memory or for people who were about those ages. Next slide. So to conclude, the young people that I showed you at the beginning were taught a history about the atomic bomb that was a source of peace, Japan becoming peaceful after the bomb. In the past tense, so they never learned about present tense nuclear weapons. They saw this history as irrelevant or unrelated to them, and they saw the anti-nuclear movement as a movement for older people. I mentioned that we can perceive Cold War as a limited nuclear war because this group, which is known as the Hiroshima and Nagasaki Peace Messengers, was actually founded following the India and Pakistan nuclear tests in the 1990s. This is not a movement about what happened in 1945, but about the past 3 decades. Next slide, please. And lastly, to conclude my talk today, so when I asked them, so why did you join these groups? Usually it was something a lot more mundane, something like, well, a teacher nominated me to give a peace speech, or a professor scouted me to the IPPNW Youth and Student Chapter, or a friend invited me to a talk, and then I joined an activity with ICANN. I saw the coverage news about the Nobel Peace Prize and I thought they were pretty cool. Seeing a poster in a karaoke room seeking volunteers, or wanting to improve their English and travel the world while seeking a career in disarmament affairs. So that's what I mean by it not having been a sense of urgency. I'm still working on the publishing of these ideas with my thesis, which hopefully will be finished by next year. And all the interviews I conducted will also be available, hopefully by the end of next year, for future research, if any of you is interested. Next slide, please. So with that, thank you. And if you're interested in this event, I've left some flyers. Thank you very much.
Tim, is it okay if I click through the next slide myself? Yeah. It'll just be a thing. So, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think we actually exchanged emails.
Yeah, we did.
So it's good that I'm presenting last. So hopefully many of us are still on a post-launch now. Let me just see if I can do the next screen. Okay, I'll just full screen. All right, hi everybody. So just before jumping into things, I wanted to quickly show this overview of all kinds of different places in the world where there's still conflicts happening. And I think that this whole map could look gray, as in no conflicts in our lifetime, but it really depends on what we do during the next few years. Regarding why I'm here, so I was here for the presentation last year, and after the presentation, I volunteered to be an interpreter for survivors of the 1945 atomic bombings in Japan. So for many days, we sailed around the world, and they would give their testimony in Japanese, and I would interpret it in other languages. And it gave me a lot of time to think about how we're going to get to a world where there's not only fewer risks of nuclear weapons, but actually something close to perpetual peace, however we want to interpret it. So I spent a lot of time with the 3 Hibakusha that are on this picture. Tanaka Terumi-san on the left is the man who gave the Nobel Peace Prize speech last December in Oslo. And my presentation is largely about what I came to realize from my trip. And it's also relating to kind of a lot of the things I look at in economics and so on, but I tried to make it as simple to understand as possible, although that's impossible. So the real question I was thinking when I was on this boat with people that are in their 80s and 90s and experienced not only World War II, but the atomic bombings, was like, where are we heading with all this, and where did we come from? And of course, I don't know anything, and I'm not even sure about that, because the more I learn, the more I learn how much I don't know, but everything I present is publicly available, so I can also share the slides later. Actually, you'll see a link to it. So I think the most important to really contextualize this is like, yeah, if we think about it over like a really long time span of like 2,000 years, and this is kind of the underpinning for, you know, geopolitical power and so on, in the views of many national security states. One thing you can find, for instance, from the Angus Madison data sets and so on, is that as you know, India or China, but not the US, was the largest economy for roughly 1800 of the last 2,000 years. And it's around 1890 that the US became the world's largest economy, and from around 1945 that the US became by far the most dominant state in the system that was created after World War II. And of course, we don't know how it's going to go when the current regime is not busy pursuing the Cultural Revolution, deporting, firing, imprisoning, or coercing what it sees as enemies in its identity war. Then there's all kinds of things that can happen. But I think one of the realities is that in many ways, whether we see it from the view of national security states, finance ministries, or otherwise, we do see this longer running trend where two countries that have over 4 times the population of the US, namely China and India, are gradually surpassing the GDP, roughly the imperfect sum of value added in an economy, whatever that means. But you get the idea. It's from the point of view of the United States, it is still the world's largest economy, but gradually China is surpassing, and India will also be on its way there. Russia is not really expected to be the same, and of course these are projections, so nobody knows what's going to happen in the future because nobody knows anything. But in many ways, this is kind of, I think, the viewpoint to understand a lot of the conflicts or rivalries between countries. And from the point of view of the United States, I think it's also really important to see why the national security state, which mostly runs independently of the political party in power, sees so much of a threat. And I think why a lot of, you know, the tripolar nuclear arms races or all these other things are happening and really difficult to stop. The first one is simply that as China became reintegrated into the world economy after roughly 2001 when it joined the WTO, there has been this rise of the country as the world's sole manufacturing superpower. So on the left-hand side, you see that China's share of world output in manufacturing is larger than most, and it's kind of similar to roughly the next 10 countries combined. And I think this is a good measure of like domination. If you, as one country in the system of imagined communities, or however you think about it, if you have as much of something as the next 10 countries combined, you are clearly dominant in that field. And so the way you can think about it also is that roughly a third of world production happens in China, a third in the non-US aligned rest of the world, and a third in US, G7, and allies. And you can also think about it in terms of value added, so how much is something worth in terms of the additional profits that come from it. And if you ask people that kind of really think about this rigorously, for example, at the UNIDO organization in Vienna, it's roughly a situation where 3/4 of world manufacturing, around 2000, used to be done by the US and its allies. So around US, one easy way to remember it is 5% of the world population, 25% of the world economy for most of the last 130 years. But now where things are heading is that China is instead approaching roughly half of world output. So from the point of view of both economic and security policymakers in the US, this is clearly a seismic change. And you can also think about it more narrowly in terms of like which countries, for example, at the frontier of something. So here is an example from how many robots are being installed in different countries. 2014 or so, there wasn't a big difference. But now, without a doubt, China's the leader in using robots in all kinds of different factories. And you can also think about it in patents. So China has by far the most patent applications in the world. It depends on which field you look at. The nomination is, of course, going to be larger in areas where it has more specialization and so on. But it is also approaching kind of the world's #1 intellectual property superpower. And so if you think about it from a US point of view, oh, this was meant to be a time lapse, but it won't work. Anyway, so 1980 was roughly like this. If you look at it in terms of the main trading partner, blue are countries that trade more with the US than with China, and you see that most of the map is blue. But then what happened over the next 20 years is that it also changed in this sense. It's mostly red, and again, the colors don't really matter. It's just the point of how much things have changed over 20, 30 years. If you think about it, from people that were that had lived most of their lives in an international system where it was the United States that had the largest contribution to world output, to manufacturing, and so on and so on. And another thing is that if you think about like not just who's trading with what, but who's actually necessarily dependent on another, the US reliance on Chinese inputs rose a lot more, while China has been trying to reduce its reliance on the US far longer than the last 8 years or so. And so I'm not endorsing any particular policy, but I think these are kind of important things that contextualize where we're at. And similarly, if you look at the share of China in strategic industries, so these are all areas where roughly 50% of the world's refining or supply is controlled by China. There's, again, many different areas where one country, one entity with a monopoly on violence in its territory and so on, however you want to define it, has a lot of decision-making power. And I think that this is kind of the situation where a lot of the discussions about international security, how to create a peaceful world, are going, because whatever we think of where things should go, this is in the minds of a lot of people in Washington, D.C. And this is just another example. If you kind of hone down a bit more on magnets and materials, things that are important for batteries and so on. In terms of the end of, like, if you want to make wind turbines, then maybe the EU has a critical role, but for much of the upstream supply chain, it is dominated by China. And what's happening in response is that it's been a few years, not too many years though, that the US and a lot of its rich country allies, whether you want to call them G7 or anything else, they've been trying to intervene. Industrial policies, basically reducing their reliance and supporting domestic and regional supply chains. And this, I think, is also kind of a reflection of policymakers gradually thinking, oh, this is something I have to pay attention to, and this is something that might be more important than all the other priorities we have, like lifting people out of poverty, working by WTO rules, and so on and so on. So you can see it in many different ways, that there's been this rise in restrictions on trade and investment versus China, Russia, but also a bunch of countries. And today when Trump, there was the note on like travel bans on a bunch of different countries, I think it's also this fragmentation, which is reflected from this underlying current that has been happening for quite a few decades. Same goes for FDI. If you think about countries investing in other places, there's a lot more restrictions. And yeah, what the IMF has been arguing since quite a while now is that we are heading towards regionalization, where there's less trade and investment between blocks and more within blocks. And I think that, especially over the past few months, but maybe over the past 3 years or so, it's been quite clear that this trend has been accelerating and might continue. That said, I don't want to bang on about like a bipolarization, which would be false, but rather this multipolar. So going back to this, the 2,000-year view, that in many ways it's harder to innovate at the frontier. Growth is slower there and so on. It's a lot easier to catch up if you have the right institutions. So as we have this multipolarization, actually China's manufacturing share of GDP is also falling, with more and more other regions, Vietnam, Mexico, Philippines, so on, getting their share of manufacturing. But I think it's not the way that a lot of policymakers in Washington might be seeing this. And if you think about it on the other side, so let's focus a bit more on the US. I mean, today it's quite clear that China leads in manufacturing, rare earths, renewables, innovation, and supply chain. The US, on the other hand, still leads in arms spending, arms exports, semiconductors, AI, and finance. And especially if you consider the military, the US spends spends around as much as the next 10 states combined. And so I think that there it's also a kind of other kind of domination. And of course, these are all choices. These are revealed preferences done on behalf of a country, or however you think about it. But this is not a concern from the point of view of a lot of folks. And one of the reasons is because a lot of people would be saying this is totally justified if you look at growth rates. So if you consider how much military spending has changed in roughly, 10 of the last 11 years or so. Sorry, that one doesn't make sense, but you get the point. If you look at roughly a 10-year change, while the US military spending has increased by around 10% over a particular period, China and India has been by roughly 60%. And the data is from CIPRI, but I think this is also something which comes back to the security dilemma concept and so on, that as long as there's other regions, you can also think of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on, increasing their military spending, a lot of other regions will see this as a threat. And part of it is also historical. I mean, you don't get to spend as much as the next 10 countries combined without having things to spend it on. So this is kind of before, you know, the US got involved in different regions and before World War I, where if you look at, for example, the Navy bases, it tended to be quite regional. I mean, you had the Monroe Doctrine, Western Hemisphere, and then Guam, Philippines, which the US was involved in for some time. And then it's really, this is just before World War II. So again, you see that there's territories like Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Panama, Philippines, Guam, where there's US bases, but you don't see the bases all over the world. And that's where things change. In 1945, with kind of the transition from British Empire to a lot of the bases being used by the US, you end up with military bases all over the place. And again, I don't want to make value judgments of what is good or bad, but it's simply that this is also one of the necessary conditions for this huge increase in arms spending. And if you think about it, in 1989, fall of Berlin Wall, you know, some would say end of Cold War, some would say end of Cold War I don't know. You get a lot of bases in different regions of the world still. And this is roughly 2015, last edition for this map, where, again, there's a lot of things that are being maintained, and some might see it as a good thing, a bad thing, others would say it's a huge waste of time, money, I don't know. But it's simply a reality that there's a lot of things going on, and way beyond what we could see with our own eyes in a lifetime. And I think the way this ties to kind of the threat perceptions is that in today's world, it would be kind of misleading to say that there's just two blocks, because, again, this is pretty crude, but countries or whatever the ruling elite happens to be that is in the country at the time might perceive one country as the foremost adversary. And on the one hand, the left-hand side, you might see that there's many states which see the US as the #1 security threat. So China, Russia, Belarus, DPRK, Iran, Venezuela, for one reason or another, might not be related, they tend to see the US as the main adversary. On the other hand, it's a lot more fragmented, where US, Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Philippines, and Taiwan might say the People's Republic of China is the greatest threat. But then you have a lot of countries that would say, actually, no. India might say Pakistan is a threat. South Korea might say DPRK is more the threat. And then countries on the west of the Russian Federation might say Russia is more the threat. And I think that one of the ways this ties into what's happening in the world is that we don't have clear, you know, like a simple way of looking at this that everybody can agree on. And if you map it out to kind of national security threats, you see these different kind of groupings. Some are more awkward than others, of some countries thinking that there's a different country that is more of a threat. And if you tie this to like military cooperation and so on, it doesn't map one-to-one. For instance, you know, as you know, many countries in NATO wouldn't agree on what's the #1 threat. Again, this map was made before 2025, so maybe things have changed a bit. But again, there's a lot of things happening here. And I'm coming to the end, but one of the things to ask is like, okay, I mean, clearly the 27 people in this room are here because they actually want to pay attention to these kind of things. We care, we think these are problems, we think we should do something about it, and we'll probably think this for the rest of our lives. What if you ask other people? Because of course, most people didn't reveal a preference to be in this room. Well, if you just look at surveys, most people, roughly 3/4 in many different countries, say that on the one hand, they expect to see another major conflict like World War I or II happen in the next 25 years. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of people becoming casualties to a conflict that is not necessary. And we might say, oh, it's because of the politicians. Like we have this politician or that dictator. But the reality is that whether you think whichever dictator or politician you dislike, by 2040, most of the ones in power won't be around anymore. You look at their ages, life expectancy, and so on. But bad leaders are going to return. And so this is kind of something that I reflected on during this long boat trip with many conversations with peace activists and politicians. In the end, the only necessary condition that I see as really being worthwhile is that we need to build the systems and the institutions that can withstand even the very worst leaders. So what I mean is political rules and social norms that constrain elites and force them, whether we like them or not, to seek the consent of the governed and to align the ruler's private interest with the public. And to me, this is kind of the way we're going to get to world peace. As idealistic as it sounds, I think this is a very realist way to get there. And actually, most people would agree. Again, if you do these surveys around the world, 85% or so agree that the world needs new international agreements and institutions. Now, whatever that means, it's not so well defined. But I think it is simply a reality that, it doesn't take Einstein to realize that the post-1945 world order doesn't really reflect today's realities and so on. And most countries would agree. And it's a question of what do we do about it? Do we spend the next 50 years writing papers, doing small nonprofits and startups and so on? Or do we try to organize around something where there seems to be an increasing number of people that would agree, maybe passively support, actively, I don't know. But I think the most important thing this really ties into, and this is a conversation I had many times with the atomic bomb survivors, who are great people, very kind people, was that in 100 years, many things that we consider to be completely normal today will be considered wrong. So a good question to ask now is, what might I be wrong about? And in some ways, this is the only worry worth having. This is from a writer called Kevin Kelly. And again, we might disagree on what exactly it is that we must change, but I think it is this idea that in the short run, there's very little we can do, but in the long run, if we organize with people that understand, pay attention, and want similar outcomes, I think there's a lot more that is possible. And the question is also, what's plan B? I mean, there's many people that have talked about all kinds of things that won't work, but the best question to ask the skeptics is, okay, but what's your plan? Because we're going to have to do something, otherwise, things will roll anyway. So thanks a lot. I have, if you want to see any slides, you can see this link. And in relation to this thing, I know it wasn't so academic. I also ended up working on this kind of platform and movement with people now in around 35 countries that agree that these are things we should work on, even if most of us might never meet in person. So I invite you to also get involved and to work with me. Thanks. Okay. Oh, it doesn't matter.
Thank you. So yes, thank you to all of the three speakers. Individually, it's very, very interesting, and I was glad to have Sam on this panel, which I specifically chose as well to moderate on. So now we're going to open the floor to Q&A. I think we're going to try to end for 5 p.m., Tim, or like 5:10, 5 p.m. based on how many potential questions there are going to be, but I will open the floor now. So yes, if you have questions, please raise your hand. And Matteo this time, not Tim, will go around and find you. Oh, also, if you could say your name and who you're affiliated with, that might be good as well.
Does it work now? Okay, sorry. Hi, I'm Beatrice from around Europe. And so thank you for your presentations. It was super interesting. I have two questions, if that's okay. One for Castro. You talked about some youth that doesn't feel very concerned by these issues. And even though they're kind of where it happened, how do you think we should educate people that don't even have this geographical connection? From your research, did you feel like that geographical connection is important? And did you think about how to do it with people that feel even more remote to this issue? Sorry, just a question for Joel as well. I kind of got this question before, but I avoided it. But how do you withstand bad leaders, especially in the nuclear context? Did you think of anything that, how to kind of foolproof institutions from bad leaders? Thank you.
So I also have two questions. One is for you, Anthea, and then the other one for you, Franco. Perhaps I start with Franco because the question goes in a similar direction than your question. We've been speaking about this also in the break. in Germany, for example, if you talk about CBN education starting in high school, for instance, one fear that I would have is that the immediate reaction of parents would be, well, this is the education that I went through in the Cold War. I don't want my child to have that same experience. And they are very strongly feeling against that militarization or securitization. What would your solution be in dealing with that in the context of what you mentioned? And then for Anthea, also something that I've talked about to some other people on the break. If you mention climate change to military folks, they will look at you and be like, well, that's nice and all, but ultimately I have to concern myself with war fighting. Why do I have to consider this broader impact? And also if you look at, for example, nuclear winter, maybe to put it a bit provocatively, well, if nuclear war breaks out, we're kind of screwed either way. So why do we care about the follow-up consequences? Maybe how would you respond to that?
Can I just quickly ask you to paraphrase your question one more time, just so I understand what the question is?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
So
paraphrase it one more time for me.
Yeah, okay. So how would you respond maybe to like parents' criticism that this would be securitization or militarization of school education if you try to talk to them about, like nuclear issues, for example?
Hello, I'm Carolina from UCL. I have two questions also, one for Franco. You focused on children at school. Do you know how their points of view differ from the parents or even their grandparents? And then another question for Joel. You mentioned how we need structural changes to hold the elites accountable, but how feasible do you think that is when we bear in mind that elites are kind of the presidents and the politicians of society? Thank you.
Sorry, Richard Guthrie again, and we may be overburdening our speakers with lots of questions. It's a particular question in relation to the sort of psychology of Hiroshima. This is going to sound a bit devil's advocate-y, but we've got two factors. One is memory of youth, but also a question that might also be part of Japanese culture. You know, we make a huge mistake always when we just assume all cultures are the same. Hiroshima is a fascinating location on one level, because of course it was the use of the first atomic bomb, but it's also the city in which the major chemical weapons program of the Japanese army was. So if anybody's visiting Hiroshima, I recommend going out to Okoneshima Island, where they have a museum about the chemical weapons production there. And one of the things in relation to the Japanese activity in the Second World War is almost that Japan doesn't like having a folk memory. And so I'm just sort of curious as to whether that might be a sort of confounding factor or an influential factor on how the youth see the nuclear issue. Because, you know, all cultures are different. I can't remember who it was with over lunchtime, we were talking about the difference between different parts of Europe, and that Nordic culture is different in many ways on certain factors than, say, much of Western Europe. And I think we need to be conscious of these potential differences. So thank you.
That's one round, then do another round after.
If I got your question, is it on? Is it on?
Hello?
Yeah, it is. Thank you. So if I got your question, is like, why should we care about linking climate change to disarmament, right? Kind of.
So I think like two aspects I wanted to mention is, on the one hand, for military folks, why should they concern themselves with climate change if they're primarily concerned with war fighting instead, because that would maybe complicate efforts for them rather. And then on the other hand, so why do we concern ourselves with climate change if like nuclear war is basically the evil that precedes it, so to speak, and it doesn't really matter what happens afterwards, to put it like very provocatively. Yeah.
Okay, so for the military standpoint, kind of, I think it's important because I've worked previously on environmental manipulation, and like we can see like climate change, like there's like drought everywhere. Like, I mean, we know, and I worked on environmental manipulation in the Middle East and how it's like not into any legal frameworks. Well, there is one, but it's very flawed. And I think it's important that just like governments, they acknowledge that this is something, and there, because of climate change, we're gonna have new forms of warfare, so environmental manipulation, but also like everything related to military, it has like, it pollutes the environments. It's like you have to become resilient in like on some fronts. So I think it's just good investing in more sustainable things in general. And why should we care? Because if there's a nuclear war, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's fair. It's a very good question. I think it's just more like a kind of using it as a wake-up call for some people that might not think about nuclear weapons on a daily basis and nuclear disarmament and weapons in general, and just using that because now everybody is concerned about climate change and using it as a way to make people interested in that, and yeah, as a wake-up call. I don't know if I responded to your questions, but yeah.
Thank you so much. No worries. Thank you so much for your hello. Thank you so much for your question about how to educate young people. The reality is that the answer is extremely complex, I would say. So one part of the answer, I believe, is to be critical of the way in which we're teaching history, and that has to do with the national context in which educational programs are designed. Typically, for example, in Japan, there's this idea that history is sometimes taught in the passive voice, right? As if the atomic bomb just happened like a natural disaster. And it's usually not taught with the past colonial and imperial, activities of Japan in Korea, in China. And in fact, some poets have tried to articulate this history. There's a very good poem called When We Say Hiroshima. And the answer is, when we say Hiroshima, people think Pearl Harbor. When we say Hiroshima, people think the rape of Nanking. When we say Hiroshima, people think like, all the other wars, and it's almost impossible to think of Hiroshima as an isolated event. But that's how sometimes it's told, as if it's not connected to the past of Japan and also not connected to our current reality, which is why I believe that the narrative that the Cold War was in a way either a hot peace or a limited nuclear war are more like critical ways of interpret history for children in a way that doesn't treat the existence of nuclear weapons as axiomatic and eternal. So that's one thing. In other countries, like in Russia or in America, some scholars actually argue that we teach our children to prepare them for war in a way through patriotism and ROTC and like military programs that aim to target and recruit young people at an early age for different purposes. And I believe that there's very limited career prospects for young people who may want to pursue a career in disarmament. So I believe that one of the ways in which if we believe that education serves a purpose for professional futures, one of the things we have to do is make disarmament more economically viable to young people, and that's partly the task of education too, to like think of how education relates to future careers. About Germany, I'm sad to reply that I don't know much about, that specific country's history in terms of like giving you an answer that would sound like good in any way. But what I can say is that usually memory culture and how we remember, especially 1945, is sometimes counters the subversive potential of things like Hiroshima. So remembering sometimes takes away things like anger and like other emotions that might be more human sometimes. So Hibakusha testimonies are often criticized. For example, there's this book about global memory by Rand Steigenberg, who argues that we remember without an intention for never again, right? Like the memory doesn't serve the purpose for never again repeating 1945. And so why do we remember? And sorry, I'm not answering your question, but I was trying my best. And for parents and grandparents, it's a very interesting question because usually parents and grandparents believe their children are either apolitical or unconcerned with social change. That's a really difficult question because youth today face more precarious socioeconomic reality in many countries, meaning inability to buy a house, to go to an education without being heavily indebted, and that raises questions about what's their ability to be political and invest free time on causes that they believe are legitimate, even if they may be seen as radical in some way. So usually it's either that they're not very interested in these issues of nuclear issues. My argument in my thesis is that young people are being channeled to pseudo activities that are not very disruptive. And yeah, and just to comment on Hiroshima lastly, some people downwinders in New Mexico would tell you the first bomb was in New Mexico and not in Hiroshima, and that's how kind of like we can contrast critically these historical narratives that are nationalized. And I don't think that the problem is that young people don't remember 1945 or the Cold War. They actually do, and they can articulate some of the things that they have been taught at museums, through school trips, through memorial days. I believe that the real problem is this channeling of young people to activities that are not very either critical or disruptive. But yeah, thank you very much.
So to address the two questions, how to withstand bad leaders and how to hold elites accountable when they're presidents or prime ministers. There's nothing new I can say on this, but there's people that have spent an entire lifetime thinking about it, and I think in many ways there's very little that a single individual can do. That's always been the case, but I think that when a lot of people have preferences that are not being satisfied, there's always the opportunity to change what we do, to organize, to make it costly, make a certain path more costly and a certain other path less costly, and that tends to influence things. You can think about social movements, all kinds of different organizations. Sometimes it takes a crisis for most people to pay attention or exert effort, but I think that there is very little that we can do in an individual capacity to kind of change the incentives for people that might start wars or not, that might be bad leaders or not. But I think it also gets to the core of who we are and why wars even start. In many ways, wars start because the people who decide whether or not to launch a conflict have a set of risks and rewards that are different from the society that they supposedly represent. So you can think about it as the politicians start wars, the soldiers have to die for it. The rich start wars, the poor have to die for it. The old start wars, the poor have to die for it, and so on. You get the idea. And I think that this is something which is obvious to a lot of people when they think about it, but you can't really start a war without getting a lot of other people to risk sacrificing their life. I can't speculate about whether it's their only life, on dying to fulfill the preferences of someone else. And so I think that in societies where the wealth, the means of production, the guns are widely distributed rather than concentrated in a few hands, that's already a lot more of a constraint for people to start a war, because it's harder to bribe people to tell them, hey, your outside option is to be in poverty, so please go to the front lines. And what we've tended to do historically is that we have grown political rules and social norms that check elites and force them to seek the consent of the governed, whether it's elections or otherwise. And these are institutions and distributions of power that help to align the interests of the ruler with that of the public. So one example that I think is, again, I'm oversimplifying, but I think it's so helpful, is like, why doesn't France invade Germany? France has nuclear weapons, Germany doesn't have nuclear weapons. Again, you can speculate. You can say, oh, Germany's a bigger economy, 6 months, I don't know what the reason is. One of the things is simply that, suppose the French president was to say, we're going to invade Germany tomorrow. would it be the German army that stops the person? No, I think it would be the French people that are not willing to die for some lunatic behavior. And I think it's a similar thing. If you don't want wars to start, what we have to do is not just build the institutions, checks and balances, whatever you want to call them, in the country we are in, from, or so on. Ultimately, I think that to be part of any imagined community is to remember some things in common, forget something in common, and we have to also cultivate this. It's kind of, there's parts of this that's culture, there's many different parts, but ultimately we have to do it in many different countries and not just our own. Because we can, in an idealistic sense, build peaceful utopias in 99% of the world's landmass. If 1% still thinks that it's okay to die because someone else told them to, that's not going to solve our problem. And I think this is maybe like a 1,000-year-old mission, who knows, but it's really about the fact that, everybody wants to go to heaven, nobody wants to die to get there, and we can work with people in different places on the things we agree upon to organize better and cultivate this culture. And I think that a lot of the things that, liberal education is meant to do, all these exchanges, tourism, international institutions, and respect for the other, a lot of it is also as an instrument towards getting there. But I think that it's not going to happen alone. It's not going to happen overnight. A lot of this is, things that emerge out of what billions of people in the world think and do, or don't pay attention to sometimes. But it is ultimately the costs of war that are the main incentive for peace. Because most of the time, wars don't start. I mean, interstate conflicts these days are very rare. Why? Because they're so costly. They destroy economies, they fracture a lot of people's lives. And so when the people who decide on war aren't accountable to the others in their nation or group, they can ignore the costs and agony of fighting. And so these leaders will take the group to war too frequently. Sometimes they expect to gain personally from conflict, and so they're enticed to start fights. So in this sense, from a historical perspective, unchecked rulers are one of the greatest drivers of conflict. And I think this holds pretty much everywhere. And for the presidents and prime ministers thing, I mean, it's no secret that presidents and prime ministers are just like you and me and most people. I think that ultimately, we pretend that we are a lot more different than we are. And I've spoken about this to people that were incumbent or past presidents or prime ministers of countries. And the reality is simply that these people also have families and friends, and often they have financial assets and all kinds of things that create incentives for them. Perhaps if they feel like the rest of the elite is going to ostracize or overthrow them, they're a lot less likely to take actions. On the other hand, if they think they can get away with ruining a lot of the net worth of whoever else is in the elite, they will be more likely to do it. And so I think there's actually many different checks and balances already. And we see this by the fact that very few leaders as well today reveal a preference to start a conflict. But I think that if we want a more peaceful world, we have to not only focus on creating checks and balances in our country, but also cultivating this culture for peace that wants to not only, keep things the way they are, but also advance them further. And also to focus on the things that most people who might not want to exert a lot of effort on can agree on and support passively. Because if you think back to like the past, 200 years, it's easy for people to claim on social media, oh, we've made no progress and the world is terrible. But really, if you think about the human rights movement, the slavery abolition movement, anti-apartheid movement, and so on, there's a lot of things which have changed in the world, I would argue for the better. And a lot of it is about do people, especially majorities, get their preferences satisfied? Are they even aware that their preferences are not being satisfied? And it's a bit like the UN system. I think that most people, if you really had a 1-hour conversation with them, which life is too short, like physically to do that, but if you ask them like, oh, do you think that the UN Security Council system is completely outdated? You would get most people that will say yes. And then it's like, well, then your preferences aren't being satisfied. And it's a question of, okay, but why should I exert effort? I mean, what's in it for me? These are things for other people. So it's also about making it easy. And I think that kind of tying this to the last thing, like the environmental aspects, I mean, I think we are at an incredible time in history where we could reveal preferences that cascade and try to organize for things that have never existed before. I think there's a lot of people doing this. What I'm saying is, again, nothing new. But so much of whether the world gets better or worse, it depends on it. So maybe to some people, this is like super naive and idealistic, and that's kind of how I define myself. But I think there's actually, it's not about what can we do, but more so about what can't we do? Because actually the entire, all these institutions and the entire outcome of like what's going to happen over the next decades depends on us collectively speaking, and yes, an individual is more part of it, but it's not like there's some, you know, I can't prove that there's a supernatural being that's going to be out to save us. And I think if we send this message to billions of people in the world today, a lot of them would agree, like, let's stop doing the nonsense, let's solve the problems we have to solve, and let's hold leaders accountable for solving the problems rather than for looking good. And I think that's something which is a good counter to most politicians that don't contribute to solving the problem. Always to ask them, okay, that's very cool, you know, you had a nice TikTok and so on, but how does this solve the problem? Like, how does this solve the problem? Ask again and again, as things might get worse, climate change might get worse and so on, more countries might get nuclear weapons, and always to bring back the attention to, okay, how does it solve the problem? Anyway, yeah.
Perfect, thank you, Joel. I just have a question from Talia Weiss to Anthea. She says, thanks for your great talk. Do you worry at all that incorporating nuclear disarmament into climate negotiations could throw a wedge in already slow or perhaps glacial international climate discussions? Nuclear states would oppose disarmament positions, but their cooperation is needed for climate treaties. If so, are there ways to mitigate this concern? And her affiliation is ISYP and Yale University. Over to you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I just started working on this, so I don't have the answer. I'm sorry, I'm gonna be very truthful on this one. But I'd be glad to talk about it with you if you want. So you can send my email. But yeah, that's all I have. What did you say?
She says, no issue, thank you, I will follow up.
She'll follow up.
Thanks.
Can I comment on it? Or do you have to?
Yes,
No, that's okay.
no comment. Yeah, go ahead. Why not?
I don't have the answer either, Talia, but I have a few ideas, and we're supposed to think freshly in this conference. So,
Yes.
you know, so it is said that the climate is, you know, that we need sort of nuclear technologies, and we need to find shortcuts to decarbonize. But for example, if we were looking for shortcuts, if we used all the energy inside the nuclear weapons that we have developed, we would have about 5 to 10 years of global energy available for us right now. Of course, no one believes that that could happen, but what I'm saying is that there's no natural inconsistency between us trying to seek disarmament at the same time as solutions to decarbonizing. And I believe that it is up to us who are at the temporal front lines of decisions about nuclear weapons to decide where we're going in the next 10 to 20 years with these decisions that will affect hundreds of people.
Maybe to add one very brief thing is that I think a lot of it also depends about when is there an overturn window, an opportunity for things to change, because I think the most skeptical interpretation of where things might be going is that everything is doomed and nothing is going to move the needle until we have a major catastrophe, a major crisis, whether it's relating to nuclear, climate, AI, pandemics, whatever you want to call it. And so one thing we should also prepare for is that, of course, nobody wants this catastrophe, but if that opens up a possibility to improve things on multiple different dimensions because, I don't know, the balance of power shifted or whatever the reason, I think it's also important to bear this question in mind, because if, for example, there are major climate or other catastrophes that mean that a lot of states build, you know, far more momentum towards reaching agreements that were difficult to do multilaterally, I think we should also push to make progress on related issues. And by also tying on this thing of like, eventually people might say, oh, I don't know, the climate aspects are going so in such a challenging manner, we have to focus on more international cooperation in general, and then also to make it clear why it's in their interest that on nuclear non-proliferation disarmament, we also get some things done, which many people have been writing about for decades, but which has been politically hampered by vested interests. So I think that's also one reason we should bear this in mind.
Okay, so I'll wrap up the panel.
Unless there are any final last bursting questions. Okay, yeah.
There's one question.
Okay, so just picking on from your examples, working with young people from Japan, we're trying to develop a small project targeting student leaders from the Eastern Horn of Africa, specifically conflicting countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and South Sudan. So talking about disarmament, would like to see how young people can get involved at the community level. But the project that we're trying to write and possibly look for funding is to build the capacity of these young people, to reach out to their parents, their mothers, and everyone so that they can willingly give back the illegal guns to the government. So I just wanted to learn from your experiences how you've gone with this and how we can replicate this kind of scenario back home. Thank you.
Yeah, send me an email, and I have plenty of ideas about things that might be useful. I'll mention two right now. There are programs that have been specifically tailored to disarmament education. One of them here in the UK is known as Highly Enriched, and they provide pedagogical materials for all levels, all the way from elementary school to high school and university, and how to teach them. So not just the materials, but also instructions for the teachers. Like that. There are also very new programs, some of them sponsored by the UN. One of them is known as the Youth Leader Fund for a World Without Nuclear Weapons. And they fund trips for young people from all over the world to be able to go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they take basically like these 4 to 5 months of disarmament education, and then they are taken to those places. Again, I have more ideas, but we can connect afterwards, and we can chat.
Just to follow up on that, was it you who asked about biological issues as well earlier? Because at the moment, I think it's about another week or two left. You come and chat to me. The UN Office for Disarmament Affairs has a program called Youth Biosecurity that looks at people from across the world, and nominations for that are currently open. So let's chat.
Okay, thank you. I think this time I'm going to wrap up